1993 Little Ocala Valley Conference Most Valuable Player, Scholastic Bowl. 1994 third highest grade point average in a graduating class of 45. 1994 Illinois State Scholar. 1994 Student of the Month. 1994 Stephen Decatur Chapter Sons of the American Revolution Good Citizenship Award recipient. 1994 James Milliken Scholars Award recipient. In various scrapbooks, yearbooks, desk drawers, and boxes at home are the numerous music awards, certificates, and honors that I received throughout my public school career. And of course, since then, there's been other awards that have been presented. But back then, when the pond is the size of a small town, with a high school enrollment of around 160 back then, it's now less than 100 today, it could feel very good to be a big fish academically, especially since I was nowhere near a star athlete, except for a one-year presidential fitness award. These were both thankful and prideful moments in my life, the highest accomplishments I had had at the beginning of my adulthood. Back in the time when, of course, I knew it all and knew exactly what I wanted and when it was all going to happen. Heaven knows, those days of self-assurance and unquestionable confidence in future accomplishments are behind me in the timeline. These days, I find it a sense of accomplishment that I can find my keys, my phone, and my glasses every time I'm looking for them each morning. So it's probably mixed emotions to recall these past glories and achievements. I can only imagine how it must have sounded opening my sermon with a list of awards and achievements. But I can imagine that you couldn't help yourself. You had to start taking notes, some mental ones at least, comparing your high school record of achievement with my statements of achievement. You also know that I have always been a strong academic learner and excelled in certain areas. But notice when I highlighted all those things that I did not highlight any failure, any struggle, any difficulty I encountered at the same time. Only what no one else could claim or achieve was what I listed to begin with. We live in a world that absolutely is consumed by comparisons. Cars, clothes, houses, incomes, careers. The key in comparison, how you always win in playing the game of comparison, is figuring out what to measure yourself against. Because we can always find measurements we exceed. We rarely disclose the measurements that reveal our shortcomings. It's our ego and pride that tend to push aside any forms of gratitude, and that tends to make us also less generous. How often do we share what level we achieved rather than what goal we failed to reach? And when we hear good things from others, we sometimes share our congratulations with our jaws clenched in jealousy. The life of faith does not require comparison. It does require generosity. Most faith-filled Christians do not recite a list of spiritual accomplishments. Most fear-filled ones will do. Unsure of where they stand, they want you to know without question where you stand compared to their standards. When you are full of yourself, there's rarely room for God to be a part of your life. And prayers will fall apart in the gap between pride and contempt. This is the second parable on prayer that we've explored in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18. The first parable was last week, where the persistent widow goes to a corrupt judge until he finally will grant her justice, and that we are reminded to be just as persistent with an even better judge than a corrupt one, God, in getting injustice reconciled, and will be providing it. As we close today our series on prayers that don't work, we are reminded that pride usually reveals prejudice. And one who seems to be a religious powerhouse can actually be discovered to be empty. And one who seemingly has no religious resources receives God's righteousness. Both men in our parable, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, went up to the temple in Jerusalem to pray. The temple in Jerusalem being the tallest point in Jerusalem, still is, where one would pray to God. Except one seems to be praying about himself to God, and the other can't even call himself anything but a sinner before God. Only one, we discover in the story, offered a genuine prayer. And for those who first heard it, it's an unexpected surprise. The Pharisee measured the quality of his spiritual life against a tax collector. The tax collector measured his life against the life of God. If I pick the standard that's going to be used for measurement, I can always find a way of measuring me that makes me exceed it. When God is the standard of measurement, I will never be able to. Jesus opens this parable, interestingly, with just the bare minimum of descriptors. Two men went up to the temple to pray. And then only after that statement says one was a Pharisee, the other was a tax collector, or in the King James Version, a publican. It is, after all too easy for us to immediately change the word Pharisee into what we have been taught to associate them with, self-righteous hypocrites. It seems that it's now a synonym of that, when it couldn't be farther from the truth in Jesus' time and place. I have found in regards to hypocrite identification that it's a lot easier for me to identify them across a room than to identify the one that's looking back at me in the mirror on Sunday morning. The Gospels tell us that there were actually several followers of Jesus who were also members of the Pharisees. And all the word for Pharisee means is simply separated ones, that they believe that their lives should be distinctive in the faith and holy, not in regards to perfection, but in upholding the Torah's commands even greater than what would be expected. In many ways, the Pharisees and Jesus' followers were similar in their outlook on what God was doing and what God was expecting of others. More like cousins than opponents. Both Pharisees and Jesus' early followers were very serious about the duties of their faith, some of them being better models and examples than others. This parable's Pharisee is not as exemplary as he has made himself believe. But he does have this extraordinary list of accomplishments to share. There's only one day required for fasting in the Torah, and that is the Day of Atonement. This Pharisee is doing it twice a week, probably on a Monday and a Thursday, eating nothing but water or only bread and water those days. He is sharing 10% of everything when only a tithe is required with certain items according to the Torah. This is certainly someone worthy, if there was such a thing, of a high honor roll status among the seriously religious. But notice in the prayer that he only addressed God once. God, I am so thankful. And then it's always I, how good I am. And then, of course, he has to incorporate a few comparisons, just in case you didn't figure out how great he already is. Let's face it here. I would hope, certainly you and those who are gathered here, don't find it too difficult to not be a thief or a scoundrel or an adulterer. You see, I can always pass the sin test when I've never been tempted by the sin in the first place. It's those sins, though, that are harder to avoid or resist that are the real measurements, are they not? When I can pick again whatever standard I want to apply to myself for my benefit or to others to their detriment, I can manipulate the answers. But the tax collector has no illusions or expectations of either acceptance by neighbor or by God. The Pharisee is covering his insecurity of his faith with self-righteous religiosity. The tax collector carries nothing to God but heartbrokenness and a straightforward assessment of how far short he is. Have mercy on me, God, a sinner, needing God and demonstrating complete trust and dependence on God's mercy. When you look closer at the Pharisee's prayer, you really don't need to even mention God in it. It's all about what he's done. One does need a merciful God to say the tax collector's prayer. Extraordinary religious piety is no guarantee of God's favor or mercy, as we are reminded at the end of the parable. Only humility can deliver favor or mercy. And humility is all the tax collector has. Now, before we talk about, oh God, look how humble I am, and we fall into, again, the pride and self-righteous trap that is impossible to do with humility. We exchange contempt for one with self-righteousness in another, a camouflaged yet revealing form of humble pride, using humility strangely to brag again. Because if it is still up to us, we will once again push God aside, as did the Pharisee, and place our ego on the altar again. Allow me to thank myself again. Wayne Dyer, a motivational speaker once spoke of ego as meaning edging God out. And he describes 6 components of this ego behavior and attitude. 1, I am what I have. 2, I am what I do. 3, I am what other people think of me. 4, I am separate from everybody else. 5, I am separate from what's missing in my life. And 6, I am separate from God. Feeding any one, let alone all 6 of these hunger, anxieties, or fears, notice that several of them are what we have, what we do, and what others think. And the others are how we differentiate ourselves from others, from what we know is missing from our lives, and whatever divinity we think is part of the universe. This will consume our lives and yet leave it unfulfilled. And a consumed life is spent, leaving nothing to give and nothing to be grateful for. We never grow out of ourselves if it is always about measuring and comparing. It will happen when we leave measuring and comparing behind, looking less around us and looking toward God. We will always feel good and spiritually superior to those whom we can easily jump over their apparent spiritual standards. We can easily surpass a neighbor's standard in public piety by just doing one more than what we see them doing. It is much more difficult to surpass the goal of seeking only God in all times and places. When the measure of our worth rises or falls with how well we are keeping above or with whatever version of the spiritual Joneses we care to measure for or against, we are in spiritual trouble. And our gratitude to God, our love of our neighbor, will suffer as well. True prayer comes from setting our lives beside the life of God. Both men in our parable today were broken spiritually. One didn't know it. One was all too aware of it. And so we are too. No matter whatever spiritual achievements or successes we have done, we will waste our time trying to keep up with the spiritual Joneses. We will discover our lives when we are trying to keep up with Jesus. The Pharisee hid his brokenness with religious piety, exceeding an unlikely rival in the game. One can succeed well if you're a Pharisee comparing yourself to a tax collector. One might have more difficulty in succeeding if one's measuring a Pharisee with a Pharisee. The tax collector knew he had nothing to compare or play games with when it involved God, only himself in an honest plea for God's mercy. Are we willing to let go of the comparison of righteousness for compassion and mercy? Faith has never been, nor should it be, about earning God's grace or displaying our righteousness for the world to see. Faith is received always as a gift and is shared with others. Faith in God is revealed when gratitude is present, not as a measurement, but as one's character. We will have times and seasons of insecurity, doubt, suffering, and struggle. But those seasons can be countered by paying attention to where we are looking. Are we looking around us or above us? Looking past our medals, awards, and achievements, and to God, who is always merciful. The Pharisee looked to himself. The tax collector could not even look upward to heaven. The one who could not even look received God's grace. May we not have our noses so far in the air that we stumble over what's in front of us. May we not pray to remind God how different we are from the rest. May we pray to be reminders for others of how different God is to whatever or whoever we may seek to find justification. And may our generosity reflect the immeasurable worth of God's mercy. That is prayer beyond all comparisons. Amen.